Welcome to Thueringer. We continue now in Zane Gray's Desert of Wheat. We are in Chapter 3. Material things, life, success, such as had inspired Kurt Dorn on this calm night, lost their significance and were seen clearly. They could not last, but the wheat there, the hills, the stars, they would go on with their task. Passion was the dominant side of a man declaring itself, and that was a matter of inheritance. But self-sacrifice, with its mercy, its succor, its seed like the wheat, was as infinite as the stars. He had long made up his mind, yet that had not given him absolute restraint. The world was full of little men, but he refused to stay little. This war that had come between him and his father had been bred on the fumes of self-centered minds, turned with an infantile fatality to greedy desires. His poor, old, blinded father could be excused and forgiven. There were other old men, sick, crippled, idle, who must suffer pain, but whose pain could be lightened. There were babies, children, women who must suffer for the sins of men. But that suffering need no longer be if men became honest and true. His sudden upflashing love had a few hours back seemed a calamity. But out there beside the whispering wheat, under the passionless stars, in the dreaming night, it had turned into a blessing. He asked nothing but to serve her, his country, his future. All at once, he who had always yearned for something unattainable had greatness thrust upon him. His tragical situation had evoked a spirit from the gods. To kiss that blue-eyed girl's sweet lips would be a sum of joy, earthly, all-satisfying, precious. The man in him trembled all over at the daring thought. He might revel in such dreams and surrender to them, since she would never know. But the divinity he sensed there in the presence of those stars did not dwell on a woman's lips. Kisses were for the present, the all too fleeting present, and he had to concern himself with what he might do for one girl's future. It was exquisitely sad and sweet to put it that way, though Kurt knew that if he had never seen Lenore Anderson, he would have gone to war just the same. He was not making an abstract sacrifice. The wheat fields rolling before him, every clod of which had been pressed by his bare feet as a boy. The father whose changeless blood had sickened at the son of his loins. The life of hope, freedom, of action, of achievement, of wonderful possibility. These seemed lost to Kurt Dorn, a necessary renunciation when he yielded to the call of war. But no loss, no sting of bullet or bayonet, no torturing victory of approaching death could balance in the scale against the thought of a picture of one American girl, blue-eyed, red-lipped, golden-haired, as she steps somewhere in the future, down a summer lane or through a blossoming orchard on soil that was free. Chapter 4. Toward the end of July, eastern Washington sweltered under the most torrid spell of heat on record. It was a dry, high country noted for an equable climate, with cool summers and mild winters. And this unprecedented wave would have been unbearable had not the atmosphere been free from humidity. The haze of heat seemed like a pall of thin smoke from distant forest fires. The sun rose a great pale red ball, hot at sunrise, and it soared blazing white at noon, to burn slowly westward through a cloudless coppery sky, at last to set sullen and crimson over the ranges. Spokane, being the only center of iron, steel, brick, and masonry in this area, resembled a city of furnaces. Business was slack, The asphalt of the streets left clean imprints of a pedestrian's feet. Bits of newspaper stuck fast to the hot tar. Down by the gorge, where the great green river made its magnificent plunges over the falls, people congregated, tarried, and were loath to leave. For here the blowing mist and the air set into motion by the falling water created a temperature that was relief. Citizens talked of the protracted hot spell, of the blasted crops, of an almost sure disaster to the wheat fields, and of the activities of the IWW. Even the war, for the time being, gave place to the nearer calamities impending. Montana had taken drastic measures against the invading IWW. The governor of Idaho had sent word to the camps of the organization that they had 5 days to leave that state. Spokane was awakening to the menace of hordes of strange, idle men who came in on the westbound freight trains. The railroads had been unable to handle the situation. They were being hard put to it to run trains at all. The train crews that refused to join the IWW had been threatened, beaten, shot at, and otherwise intimidated. The Chamber of Commerce sent an imperative appeal to representative wheat raisers, ranchers, lumbermen, farmers, and bade them come to Spokane to discuss the situation. They met at the Hotel Davenport, where luncheon was served in one of the magnificently appointed dining halls of that most splendid hotel in the West. The lion of this group of Spokane capitalists was Reisenberg, a man of German forebears, but all American in his sympathies, with a son already in the army. Reisenberg was president of a city bank and of the Chamber of Commerce. His first words to the large assembly of clean-cut, square-jawed, intent-eyed Westerners were, "Gentlemen, we are here to discuss the most threatening and unfortunate situation the Northwest has ever called upon to meet." His address was not long, but it was stirring. The Chamber of Commerce could provide unlimited means, could influence and control the state government, but it was from the visitors invited to this meeting, the men of the outlying districts which were threatened, that objective proofs must come, and the best methods of procedure. The first facts to come out were that many crops were ruined already, but owing to the increased acreage that year, a fair yield was expected. That wheat in the Bend would be a failure, though some farmers here and there would harvest well. That the lumber districts were not operating on account of the IWW. Then it was that the organization of men who called themselves the industrial workers of the world drew the absorbed attention of the meeting. Depredations already committed stunned the members of the Chamber of Commerce. President Reisenberg called upon Beardsley, a prominent and intelligent rancher of the southern wheat belt. Beardsley said, "It is difficult to speak with any moderation of the outrageous eruption of the IWW. It is nothing less than rebellion, and the most effective means of suppressing rebellion is to apply a little of that direct action which is the favorite diversion of the IWWs. The IWW do not intend to accomplish their treacherous aims by anything so feeble as speech. They scorn the ballot box. They are against the war, and their method of making known their protest is by burning our grain, destroying our lumber, and blowing up freight trains. They seek to make converts not by argument, but by threats and intimidation. We read that Western towns are seeking to deport these rebels. In the old days, we can imagine more drastic measures would have been taken. The Westerners were handy with the rope and the gun in those days. We are not counseling lynch law, but we think deportation is too mild a punishment. We are too civilized to apply the old Roman law, spare the conquered and extirpate the rebels. But at least we could intern them. The British have found it practicable to put German prisoners to work in useful employment. Why couldn't we do the same with our rebel IWWs?" Jones, a farmer from the Yakima Valley, told that businessmen, housewives, professional men, and high school boys and girls would help to save the crop of Washington to the nation in case of labor trouble. Steps already have been taken to mobilize workers in stores, offices, and homes for work in the orchards and grain fields should the IWW situation seriously threaten harvests. Pledges to go into the hay or grain fields or the orchards with a statement of the number of days they were willing to work had been signed by virtually all the men in northern Yakima. Helmar, lumberman from the Blue Mountains, spoke feelingly. He said, "My company is the owner of a considerable amount of timbered lands and timber purchased from the state and from individuals. We have been engaged in logging that land until our operations have been stopped and our business paralyzed by an organization which calls itself the Industrial Workers of the World, and by members of that organization and other lawless persons acting in sympathy with them. Our employees have been threatened with physical violence and death. Our works are picketed by individuals who camp out in the forests and who intimidate and threaten our employees. Open threats have been made that our works, our logs, and our timber will all be burned. Sabotage is publicly preached in the meetings, and in the literature of the organization it is advised and upheld. The open boast is made that the lumbering industry, with all other industry, will be paralyzed by this organization, by the destruction of property used in industry, and by the intimidation of laborers who are willing to work. A real and present danger to the property of my company exists. Unless protection is given to us, it will probably be burned and destroyed. Our lawful operations cannot be conducted because laborers who are willing to work are fearful of their lives and are subject to abuse, threats, and violence. Our camps, when in operation, are visited by individuals belonging to the said organization, and the men peaceably engaged in them threatened with death if they do not cease work. All sorts of injury to property by the driving of spikes in logs, the destruction of logs, and other similar acts are encouraged and recommended. As I pointed out to the sheriff of our county, the season is a very dry one, and the woods are and will be, unless rain comes, in dangers of disastrous fires. The organization and its members have openly and repeatedly asserted that they will burn the logs in the woods and burn the forests of this company and other timber holders before they will permit logging operations to continue. Many individuals belonging to the organization are camped in the open in the timbered country, and their very presence is a fire menace. They are engaged in no business except to interfere with the industry and to interfere with the logging of this company and others who engaged in the logging business. We have done what we could in a lawful manner to continue our operations and to protect our employees. We're now helpless and place the responsibility for the protection of our property and the protection of our employees upon the Board of County Commissioners and upon the officers of the county. Next, President Reisenberg called upon a young reporter to read paragraphs of an IWW speech he had heard made to a crowd of 300 workmen. It was significant that several members of the Chamber of Commerce called for a certain paragraph to be reread. It was this: "If you working men could only stand together, you could do in this country what has been done in Russia," declared the IWW orator. You know what the working men did there to the slimy curs, the gunmen and the stool pigeons of the capitalistic class. They bumped them off. They sent them up to say, "Good morning, Jesus." After a moment of muttering and another silence, the president again addressed the meeting. "Gentlemen, we have Anderson of Golden Valley with us today. If there are any of you present who do not know him, you surely have heard of him. His people were pioneers. He was born in Washington. He is the type of the men who have made the Northwest. He fought the Indians in early days and packed a gun for the outlaws. And today, gentlemen, he owns a farm as big as Spokane County. We want to hear from him. When Anderson rose to reply, it was seen that he was pale and somber. Slowly he gazed at the assembly of waiting men, bowed, then he began impressively. Gentlemen and friends, I wish I didn't have to throw a bomb into this here campfire talk, but I've got to. You're all talking IWW. Facts have been told showing a strange and sudden growth of this here four-flush labor union. We've had dealings with them for several years, but this year it's different. All at once, they've multiplied and strengthened. There's something behind them. A big unseen hand is stacking the deck. And countrymen, that tremendous power is German gold. Anderson's deep voice rang like a bell. His hearers sat perfectly silent. No surprise showed, but faces grew set and hard. After a pause of suspense, in which his denunciation had time to sink in, Anderson resumed. A few weeks ago, a young man, a stranger, came to me and asked for a job. He could do anything, he said, and I hired him to drive my car. But he wasn't much of a driver. We went up in the Bend country one day, and on that trip I got suspicious of him. I caught him talking to what I reckon was IWW men. And then back home again, I watched him and kept my ears open. It didn't take long for me to find discontent among my farm hands. I hire about 100 hands on my ranches during the long off-season, and when harvest comes around, a good many more. All I can get, in fact. Well, I found my hands quitting me, which was sure unusual, and I laid it to that driver. One day not long ago, I run across him hobnobbing with a strange man I'd seen talking with him on the Bend trip. But my driver, Nash, he calls himself, didn't see me. That night I put a cowboy to watch him, and what this cowboy heard put together two and two was that Nash was assistant to an IWW leader named Glidden. He had sent for Glidden to come to look over my ranch. Both these IWW men had more money than they could well carry, lots of it gold. The way they talked to this money proved that they did not know the source, but the supply was unlimited. Next day, Glidden could not be found, but my cowboy had learned enough to show his methods. If these proselyters could not coax or scare trusted men to join the IWW, they tried to corrupt them with money. And in most cases, they're successful. I've not yet sprung anything on my driver, Nash, but he can't get away, and meanwhile I'll learn much by watching it. Maybe through Nash, I can catch Glidden. And so, gentlemen, here we have a plain case, and the menace is enough to chill the heart of every loyal citizen. Any way you put it, if harvests can't be harvested, if wheat fields and lumber forests are burned, if the state militia has to be called out, any way you put it, our government will be hampered. Our supplies kept from our allies, and so the cause of Germany will be helped. The IWW have backed them an organized power with a definite purpose. There can hardly be any doubt that that power is Germany. The agitators and leaders throughout the country are well paid. Probably they, as individuals, do not know who pays them. Undoubtedly, a little gang of men makes the deals, handles the money. We read that every U.S. attorney is investigating the IWW. The government has determined to close down on them, but the lawyers and law are slow to act. Meanwhile, the danger to us is at hand. Gentlemen, to finish, let me say that down in my country, We're going to rustle the IWW in the good old Western way. Chapter 5. Golden Valley was the Garden of Eden of the Northwest. The southern slope rose to the Blue Mountains, whence flowed down the innumerable brooks that, uniting to form streams and rivers, abundantly watered the valley. The black reaches of timber extended down to the grazing uplands, and these bordered on the sloping golden wheat fields, which in turn contrasted so vividly with the lower green alfalfa pastures. Then came the orchards with their ruddy, mellow fruit, and lastly the bottomlands, where the vegetable gardens attested to the wonderful richness of the soil. From the mountainside, the valley seemed a series of colored benches, stepping down black to gray and gray to gold, and gold to green with purple tinge, and on to the perfectly ordered, many-hued floor with its innumerable winding, tree-bordered streams glinting in the sunlight. The extremes of heat and cold never visited Golden Valley. Spokane and the Bend country, just now sweltering in a torrid zone, might as well have been in the Sahara, for all the effect it had on this garden spot of all the inland empire. It was hot in the valley, but not unpleasant. In fact, the greatest charm in this secluded vale was its pleasant climate all the year round. No summer cyclones, no winter blizzards, no cloud bursts or bad thunderstorms. It was a country that once lived in could never be left. There were no poor inhabitants in that great area of 2,500 miles. And there were many who were rich. Prosperous little towns dotted the valley floor, and the many smooth, dusty, much-used roads all led to Ruxton, a wealthy and fine city. Anderson, the rancher, had driven his car to Spokane. Upon his return, he had with him a detective, whom he expected to use in the IWW investigations, and a neighbor rancher. They had left Spokane early, and had endured almost insupportable dust and heat. A welcome change began as they slid down from the bare desert into the valley. And once across the Copper River, Anderson began to breathe freer and to feel he was nearing home. God's country, he said, as he struck the first low swell of rising land, where a cool wind from off the wooded and watered hills greeted his face. Dust there still was, but it seemed a different kind, and smelled of apple orchards and alfalfa fields. Here were hard, smooth roads, and Anderson sped his car miles and miles through a country that was a verdant, fragrant bower, and across bright, shady streams and by white little hamlets. At Huntington, he dropped his neighbor rancher, and also the detective, Hall, who was to go disguised into the districts overrun by the IWW. A further run of 40 miles put him on his own property. Anderson owned a string of farms and ranches extending from the bottomlands to the timberline of the mountains. They represented his life of hard work and fair dealing. Many of these orchard and vegetable lands he had tenant farmers work on shares. The uplands or wheat and grass he operated himself. As he had accumulated property, he had changed his place of residence from time to time, at last to build a beautiful and permanent home farther up on the valley slope than any of the others. It was a modern house, white and with a red roof, situated upon a high-level bench with the waving gold fields sloping up from it and the green squares of alfalfa and orchards below. It appeared a landmark from all around and could be plainly seen from the vale, the nearest little town 5 miles away. Anderson had always loved the open, and he wanted a place where he could see the sun rise over the distant valley gateway and watch it set beyond the bold black range in the west. He could sit on his front porch, wide and shady, and look down over 2,000 acres of his own land. But from the back porch, no eye could have encompassed the limit of his broad, swelling slopes of grain and grass. From the main road, he drove up to the right of his house, where, under a dip of wooded slope, clustered barns, sheds, corrals, granaries, engine and machinery houses, a store, and the homes of hired men, a little village all in itself. The sounds he heard were a welcome home, the rush of swift water, not 20 yards from where he stopped the car in the big courtyard, the pound of hoofs on the barn floor, the shrill whistle of a stallion that saw and recognized him, the drawling laugh of his cowboys, and the clink of their spurs as they became aware of his return. Nash, the suspected driver, was among those who hurried to meet the car. Anderson's keen, covert glance made note of the driver's worried and anxious face. Nash, she'll need a good looking over, he said as he uncovered bundles in the back seat and lifted them out. All right, sir, replied Nash eagerly. A note of ended strain was significant in his voice. Here, you Jake, cheerily called Anderson to a raw-boned, gaunt-faced fellow who wore the garb of a cowboy. Boss, I'm powerful glad to see you home, replied Jake as he received bundle after bundle until he was loaded down. Then he grinned. Maybe you want a pack hoss. You're hoss enough for me. Come on, he said. And waving the other men aside, he turned toward the green, shady hill, above which the red and white of the house just showed. A bridge crossed the rushing stream. Here Jake dropped some of the bundles and Anderson recovered them. As he straightened up, he looked searchingly at the cowboy. Jake's yellow-gray eyes returned the gaze, and that exchange showed these two of the same breed and sure of each other. Nothing come off, boss, he drawled, but I'm glad you're home. Did Nash leave the place? Worried Anderson. Twice a night, and he was gone long. I didn't follow him because I seen he didn't take no luggage. And that boy has some sporty clothes. He was sure coming back. Any sign of his pard, that Glidden? Nope. But there's been more'n one new feller snooking round. Have you heard from any of the boys with the cattle? Yep. Bill Weeks rode down. He said a bunch of IWWs were camping above Blue Spring. That means they've moved on down to the edge of the timber and all comfortable near our wheat. Bill says they're killing our stock for meat. Huh. How many in the gang? Inquired Anderson darkly. His early dealings with outlaw rustlers had not left him favorably inclined toward losing a single steer. Wow, I reckon we can't say. Maybe 500, counting all along the valley on this side. Then we hear there's more on the other. Boss, if they get ugly, we're going to lose stock, wheat, and maybe some blood. So many as that, ejaculated the rancher in amaze. They come and go, and lately they're mostly coming, replied Jake. When do we begin cutting grain? I reckon tomorrow. Adams didn't want to start till you got back. It'll be barley and oats for a few days, and then the wheat, if we can get the men. And has Adams hired any? Yes, a matter of 20 or so. They swore they wasn't IWWs, but Adams says, so do I, that some of them are men who first claimed to be our old hands, that they did belong to the IWW. And so we've got to take a chance if we're going to harvest 2,000 acres of wheat. I reckon, boss. Any reports from Ruxton Way? Well, yes, but I reckon you better get your supper before I tell you, boss. Jake, you said nothing had come off. Wow, nothing has around here. Come on now, boss. Miss Lenore says I was to keep my mouth shut. Jake, who's your boss? Me or Lenore? Well, you ain't, but I ain't disobeying Miss Lenore. Anderson walked the rest of the way up the shady path to the house without saying any more to Jake. The beautiful white house stood clear of the grove, bright in the rays of the setting sun. A barking of dogs greeted Anderson, and then the pattering of feet. His daughters appeared on the porch. Kathleen, who was 10, made a dive for him, and Rose, who was 14, came flying after her. Both girls were screaming joyously. Their sunny hair danced. Lenore waited for him at the step, and as she mounted the porch, burdened by the three girls, his anxious, sadly smiling wife came out to make perfect the welcome home. No, not perfect, for Anderson's joy held a bitter drop. The absence of his only son. "Oh, Dad, what all did you fetch me?" cried Kathleen, and she deserted her father for the bundle-laden Jake. "And me," echoed Rose. Even Lenore, in the happiness of her father's return, was not proof against the wonder and promise of those many bundles. They all went within through a hall to a great, cozy living room. Mrs. Anderson's very first words, after her welcoming smile, were a half-faltered, any news of Jim?" "Why, yes," replied Anderson hesitatingly. Suddenly the three sisters were silent. How closely they resembled one another then. Lenore, a budding woman, Rose, a budding girl, and Kathleen, a rosy, radiant child. Lenore lost a little of her bloom. "What news, Father?" she asked. "Haven't you heard from him?" returned Anderson. "Not for a whole week. He wrote the day he reached Spokane, but then he hardly knew anything except that he'd enlisted." "I'm sure glad Jim didn't wait for the draft," replied the father. "Well, Mother and girls, Jim was gone when I got to Spokane. All I heard was that he was well when he left for Frisco and strong for the aviation corps." "Then he means to be an aviator," said Lenore with quivering lips. "Sure, if he can get in, and he's wise. Jim knows engines. He has a knack for machinery, and nerve. No boy ever had more. He'll make a crack flyer."